Ухаживал.
И в сортире их замочим, в конце концов.
Свобода лучше, чем не свобода.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
Welcome to Infocom. In the new episode of Focus on Russia, our guest is Dr. Artyom Tonoyan, who is a sociologist based in Minneapolis. Dr. Tonoyan, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Tigran, for extending the invitation, and I'm pleased to be in your studio.
First of all, congratulations on the publication of the book. You are the editor of a volume entitled Black God and Aflame, the Nagorno-Karabakh Conflict in the Soviet and Russian Press. This is really a treasure trove of invaluable information for researchers and all the other people who are interested in the conflict. How did you come up with the idea of the book? Did the Second Karabakh War play a role in your decision to write this volume?
The idea of the book came about after an extensive conversation I had with the publisher of the book, the CEO of a company based in Minneapolis called Eastview Information Services. Yes, the war was the catalyst behind the book. We were having a conversation about how the war was unfolding, and Eastview Information Services sits on a wealth of information and scholarly databases and Soviet newspapers, Russian newspapers, and so on and so forth. So in the midst of the war and in the midst of these conversations that we were having, we thought that having a resource, the type of this book that became, was really important to sort of give the scholars the context and the longue durée context of the conflict, and have them access the information in a language that is understandable to Western scholars. As you may know, unfortunately, a lot of scholars specializing in post-Soviet space do not have the linguistic abilities or the capacity to have field trips and archival research and so on and so forth. So we thought, if they can't go to the archives and to the newspaper archives, we can bring these newspapers and the articles to them in a language that's understandable to them.
Yeah, that's really important. And a book is a compilation of articles from the Soviet and Russian press, which gives an understanding to a reader about the thought process of the Soviet leadership, because the press at the time, probably the publications, the press coincided with the thinking process in the Moscow elite. So one of the things I've noticed reading the first chapters of the book is the attitude of the Soviet leadership towards the conflict. It seems that the Soviet authorities were viewing this conflict in the realm of economic grievances, and their solutions to the conflict were also in this realm. The solutions were socio-economic. And why I'm mentioning this, because after the end of the 2020 Second Karabakh War, it seems that the Russian leadership has a similar approach to the conflict. If back in the day the Soviet authorities were trying to resolve the conflict by allocating socio-economic support to Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russian authorities have the same understanding of the root causes of the conflict, but their solutions are also economic, but they are more in the neoliberal tradition, like opening of borders, free trade, and so on. So why do you think that the Russian government, after 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is still viewing the conflict in the Marxist tradition of economic grievances?
Yeah, it's actually a very good question and an important understanding of the thrust of the book, so to speak. Yes, the Soviet solution to the conflict was informed by and large by Marxist-Leninist understanding of how power works, how the economy works and how shadow economy works and so on and so forth. So when the conflict first became to the fore, they found it, they were pretty much shocked. You can read and it becomes rather obvious how much of a shock to the system and to the Soviet leadership the conflict was. All of a sudden you have a set of grievances to the solution of which they lacked the necessary tools. So of necessity almost, they thought that throwing money at the problem solves the issue. And you would think that 30 years of the conflict and a host of other attendant issues like the cultural, religious aspects, historic aspects, and so on and so forth would be dealt in the halls of power in the Kremlin in a much more modernized version. But when you look at how they envisioned the conflict, even the commentariat, and the Russian commentariat and the Soviet commentariat, the way they looked at the conflict was pretty static. They were not understanding, and they probably to this day, they lack the understanding of how dynamic the conflict was, how given all sorts of circumstances, how the conflict's nature would even be changing, and so on and so forth. So, and when I was compiling the articles, actually, one of the things that was illustrative of this was how similar the verbiage used by the Soviet government was used by governments that follow the fall of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin's administration, Yeltsin's foreign minister, the Putin administration, and the many foreign ministers that came to become part of the Kremlin thinking mechanism. They were pretty much using similar terminology and similar verbiage. And one day I thought, goodness, it's as if there is a safe somewhere in the Kremlin, and when the conflict raises its head, they go to this safe, they open up the safe, bring out this dossier, and this is the words we're going to use, and we're going to use them now. So I don't know why they continue to look at the conflict from an economic standpoint, but there is something to be said about old dogs learning new tricks. The thinking has unfortunately continued, and the thinking has ossified, and I'm not sure if it's going to go away. But yes, the Marxist-Leninist understanding of the nationalities questions has sort of continued as a dominant paradigm in understanding the conflict. And it also probably comes down to, the lack of probably training among the advisors that advise the government in Russia or anywhere else, really. So that's probably one of the reasons.
Yeah, that's really interesting that the diagnosis is Marxist-Leninist and the solutions are neoliberal.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that authoritarian regional powers as Russia and Turkey have adopted neoliberal toolkit in a process, in a post-war process. The other thing I would like to discuss is the attitude of the Russian liberal press towards the conflict. In my understanding, the liberal press in Russia in the 90s was quite pro-Armenian. That's my perception of their articles and all the other publications. How has the attitude of the liberal press in Russia changed throughout the years towards Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? Because the coverage of the Second Karabakh War, you cannot call it pro-Armenian. So what was the evolution of the coverage?
You're absolutely, again, correct to note how the liberal press and liberal intellectuals in Russia from the get-go, were pretty pro-Armenian, or rather pretty pro-human rights.
Yeah.
Not necessarily pro-Armenian, but human rights. They looked at the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict from within that vantage point. that there were Armenians, they were a minority within Azerbaijan, and the discrimination that was happening against the Armenians was widespread and noticeable, and many of the Russian liberal intellectuals were were among the first people and experts to travel to the region to try to understand what was happening on ground level. So their fact-finding informed their opinions. Now, why during the Second Karabakh War the Russian liberal press decide to change the tone? I find it rather difficult to decipher, because as a commentator during the conflict, I also followed the Russian press, the Dozhd, for instance, the flagship Russian media and the TV channel, and I read the Russian liberal press, like the Novaya Gazeta and so on and so forth. So they were trying to sort of appear to be above the fray. They were not trying to take sides, which is, in a conflictual situation, is somewhat admirable and somewhat understandable. But given how Azerbaijan was waging the war, the vast human rights violations, again, the key word being here, human rights, and the brutalities that the Azerbaijani army meted out on the Armenian civilians, bombing civilian targets, and multiple videos of mutilation of bodies and even beheading of Armenians, you would think that in situations like this, especially the liberal press would sort of eschew the truism that coins have two sides. And when human rights violations of this sort are concerned, you would think that liberals would be at the forefront in addressing this. I don't know the reason why they would be sort of try to appear above the fray, but it was a lamentable fact. And I think, and I hope, one of these days they will have a deep and abiding soul searching as to why they did not abide by their liberal principles and cover the war the way they did.
Yeah, absolutely agree with the points. And in the third part of the book, focuses on the geopolitical interests of different powers in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We're talking about Turkey, Russia, the United States, and Iran. Could you briefly introduce how those interests have changed throughout the years and throughout the last 3 decades?
Sure. Of particular interest in the chapters that I selected, the articles, for me personally, were the Russian and the Turkish angles. The Russian angle, if we look at a heartbeat, a cardiogram of sorts, the Russian, attitude is somewhat stable, but given its geopolitical objectives and its sort of changing geopolitical visions, its positions would somewhat shift. As I say in the book, in the introduction, that oftentimes the Russian leadership, even the Russian media, would put out articles, or the Russian leadership would make statements that would be perceived pro-Armenian, to the consternation of Baku. At other times, the Russian leadership, when it was looking to gain some points with Baku, it would go out and make statements that would be perceived pro-Azerbaijani, pro-Baku, to the consternation of the Armenian government, the Armenian leadership, and the Armenian expert community. But at all times, regardless of Russia's sort of changing circumstantial attitudes, all of it was done, in pursuit of the benefit of the Russian government, which is understandable. Russia has no obligation whatsoever to be beneficial to one party or the other. We can talk about the treaties and we can talk about mutual military obligations and so on and so forth, but it's a different question altogether. The other thing that was interesting to me, and this, looking through the newspaper articles, it was sort of a trip down the memory lane, how Turkey's position would change over the years. And one of the most interesting articles that is in the book is an interview, I think with Izvestia or Pravda, I can't remember exactly, with the Turkish ambassador in the Soviet Union at the collapse, at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and who became, I think, at the same time, the new ambassador to the Russian Federation, where the interviewer is asking, okay, you were one of the very first countries to recognize Azerbaijan's independence. Does this mean that Azerbaijan can now rely on, NATO-grade weapons supplies and military and political support? And the Turkish ambassador says, stop, it's not going to happen, because if we supply weapons and if we supply Azerbaijan with a host of, with a variety of political and military support, it's going to inflame the conflict further. So this is in 1991, and boy, have times changed. Turkey, in 1991, who would have thought that Turkey would be much more predictable, but in terms of being wholly in the Western side of things, Turkey would rather not fuel the conflict further. And within 30 years, it's interesting how Turkey's trajectory in terms of how it perceived the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict changed, especially in 1994 and 1993, 1994 with the Armenian gains and so on and so forth, and with the ceasefire agreement. Turkey's position starts gradually, then drastically change. By the time we get to 2010s under Erdogan, Turkey's position has made a 180-degree change. And Turkey now perceives that support of Azerbaijan is not just important, it is paramount. And and I think the result of the recent war speaks to that fact. There's not a whole lot to be said about, although I have several articles on Iran and the United States in the book, in that particular part of the book. The Russian commentariat we're not looking at the Iranian involvement with the same degree of apprehensiveness as the Turkish involvement. And so that reflects on their understanding of the Iranian involvement in the region and in the regional affairs. And there was a great deal of apprehension about the American involvement. And the Russians always thought, and this sort of line of thinking pretty much continues until today, that the Americans are trying to sweep the rug from under their feet by inserting themselves in regional politics and so on and so forth. So the grievances, Russian grievances, government level and at the level of experts, is reflected in these selections of articles.
And there are no concluding remarks in the end of the book. So if one day you publish the second or the third edition of the book and you decide to write a conclusion, what would be the main findings and trends that would be included in the conclusion?
That's an interesting question, and I haven't given much thought to it, so I will have to improvise here. One of the reasons I didn't write a concluding remarks was that a couple of days ago, someone asked me why there were no concluding remarks or why there is no analysis. And I gave this analogy. I said, I basically, during the project, I thought of myself as a scuba diver who dives and gets out the pearls, puts them in the bank, and it's up to the researcher to rob that bank, and to sort of polish the pearls that I have brought to the surface. So when I was compiling the book, I did not want to insert my sort of opinions and my biases, and they are real. I'm a very opinionated guy, and it is very hard, sort of, when you're writing an analytical piece about some of this stuff. It's not that difficult, but it becomes taxing to sort of remove yourself from the situation and give an analysis that will benefit the reader and will do justice to the material that I unearthed and compiled. So that's one of the reasons I didn't want to sort of provide an analytical framework. And, with the selection of the articles, I think there is enough information for an informed reader or for an uninformed reader to draw their own conclusions. I just didn't want to move the marker one way or another. Now, what would I write in the concluding remarks? Probably would have to be one or two sentences. Talking to you, talking to many experts in the country, there's a real lack of understanding about what Russia thinks about the region. People have taken Fyodor Tyutchev and run with it, with the famous line that you can't understand Russia by mind alone. And that it sort of has become this excuse that Russia is irrational, that or the Russian mind is irrational, or the Russian political thinking is irrational, and it is an excuse. So I would say read the Russian press closely, because even as this book demonstrates, in whole or in part, Russian articles, even in independent media and the state-run media, they reflect the thinking in the halls of power in the Kremlin. But at the same time, it is a dual function, it has a dual function, which is it also shapes thinking within the halls of power. The Russian policymakers and decision makers, they base their decisions and they formulate policy on something. And this something is either a white paper that has been brought to their attention from a think tank that deals with these issues, or they read the newspapers and willy-nilly, consciously or on a subconscious level, they're informed by the opinions of opinion makers, people that write op-eds or people that travel to the region and write articles about it. Most of them don't have a time to read, tomes and volumes of historical background research and scholarly articles and so on and so forth. So they take the easy path, the newspapers. So read the papers, understand the papers. Russia is a rational actor, and draw your conclusions about how to best approach to one of the greatest powers on planet Earth. And don't live by myth-making. There is a lot of myths about our understanding of how Russia works, how the Russian government works, and so on and so forth. So the book's purpose in reality is this. It tries to sort of undermine a lot of the myths and a lot of the wrong-headed understanding of Russian policy for the region.
Very, very well said. Dr. Tonoyan, thanks a lot for an extremely interesting conversation.
Thank you, Tigran, and thank you, Infocom, for hosting me here. Thank you.
Thank you.